And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet, and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. And she said, If I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, Touch my garments. And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Starting with the story of Jesus calming the storm in the previous chapter, this larger section has been focused on various miracles that Jesus performs. And they have all been tied together, first of all, geographically. They all take place either on or around the Sea of Galilee. So in the flow of the narrative, the setting indicates first that they should be treated as a unit. More importantly, they are tied together theologically, so that when we see Jesus performing these extraordinary miracles, we are not to simply sit back and marvel, saying to ourselves, I've never seen something quite so amazing. Rather, the miracles are intended to push us further, so that we might inquire as to the identity of the one who performs those amazing miracles. Hence, after Jesus calmed the storm, Mark introduced this larger section with the question, Who then is this? And that's the question that you are to be asking. Who then is this? And of course, we've been unpacking the answer to that question over the last couple of weeks. Who then is this? This is the one who can cast out demons, even a legion of them. And he can do so with nothing more than his mere words. He has authority over Satan. Recall the parable that Jesus told in Mark chapter 3. He said, No one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. If you remember, I pointed out that the strong man is Satan. Jesus has bound him, and now he's entering his house and plundering his goods, namely those who are captive under Satan's dominion. And so the demoniac that no one could subdue, the demoniac who could not be bound, not even with iron chains, was in the end bound by the word of Jesus Christ. Who then is this? As we see today, he is the one who has authority not only over demons, but also over disease, and not only over disease, but even over death itself. There is kind of a crescendo that's building up throughout this chapter. That climax is at the end of chapter 6, when Jesus raises the little girl from the dead. That story will be for next week. But with that conclusion, we are left unmistakably clear as to who this man is. For no one can control the storms. No one can control the demons. No one can control diseases and even life and death other than God himself. Jesus is the Son of God. And so perhaps for that very reason, our story today is all the more poignant. Because when we keep within our purview what Mark is trying to establish, namely Jesus' divine nature and his unlimited power, it is rather startling to see that this transcendent God is not so transcendent that he cannot be bothered with the likes of mere mortals. On the contrary, more than any other passage thus far today, we will be confronted with the compassion of Jesus. His compassion for those in need. And if I had to pick a theme that underlines not just our passage, but the next as well, that's what it would be, the compassion of Jesus Christ, or the pity behind his power. Hopefully you're getting pretty good at this by now, but you will have noticed that we have here another Markan sandwich or interpolation. Verse 21, if you look with me in your Bible, verse 21 introduces the story of Jairus and his daughter, but that story is interrupted in the middle of verse 24 by the story of the hemorrhaging woman. And it's not until verse 35 that Jairus' story is resumed. And so the story of Jairus sandwiches the story of the woman. To remind you, Mark uses this literary technique in order to emphatically communicate certain truths. Whenever you have a sandwich, both passages serve to enhance and interpret each other. And in many cases, it's the center story or the center passage that provides the key to unlock the meaning of the whole, as we'll see that is the case for our story today. We'll be going through our passage under three headings this morning. Number one, the disease of the woman with the discharge of blood. Number two, the desperation of the woman. And number three, the deliverance of the woman. So, the disease, desperation, and the deliverance. Let's pray one more time. And get right into it. Father in heaven, we thank you that you are indeed a compassionate God, and you show mercy to us when we believe in you. We thank you that as we read these pages in the Gospels, we see that time and time again you reach down and condescend, not just in having taken on human flesh, but you condescend even further and reach out to those who are considered the lowest of the lows amongst human beings. And we do not fear to spend time with those who are ostracized, those who do not belong to American society. Help us, we pray, that we can go through this passage. This might not just be an intellectual exercise, but as we see your compassion, we might also in turn be molded into your image, that we might strive for the help and the power of the Holy Spirit, and more like you, and to show your compassion and testify to your gospel in this world. Be with us now as we look at this text. We pray these things in the strong name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Now, before we even get to the story of the woman, first we are introduced to Jairus. Now, initially, when I was preparing this sermon, I thought to quickly glance over verses 21 to 24. After all, it's part of the outer sandwich, which we're technically not going to get to until next week. And so I was going to save it really until later. Then the more I looked at this passage, the more I realized that you need the beginning in order to appreciate the middle. You can't skip over. And so follow along with me in these initial verses. It may seem like Mark is simply setting the stage, which he is, but the information he provides is actually quite critical to our understanding. So verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. We're back now on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, presumably in Capernaum, which is the town where most of the story has taken place thus far. And we find Jesus and his disciples here only moments after having crossed over to the eastern side. Because to remind you, after Jesus had cast out the legion from the demoniac, the Gentile crowds there asked him to leave. And so he complied. Well, in contrast to the Gentiles, the Jews are more than eager to have him. As we read, a great crowd gathered about him. Surprise, surprise, the crowds have gathered. We've seen this before, we'll see it again, and again, and again. Don't mistake this repetitive monotony as Mark being a lousy storyteller. or lacking creativity in the choice of his words. The monotony is deliberate, and it regularly reminds us of something quite astounding if you only pause and think about it. When you read the Gospels, you will discover that the entirety of Jesus' last 3 years of ministry, which was also the last 3 years of his life, was done entirely in the public. Yes, he took the occasional breaks. He withdrew in order to rest and recharge, as we saw when he slept on the boat, but those moments were the exceptions. By and large, Jesus spent the vast majority of 3 long years persisting in the very things that we've been looking at in our series. He was constantly preaching and proclaiming the gospel of God. He was constantly performing miracles, healing people of their illnesses, casting out many demons. So much so that John writes that if he were to report all of Jesus' miracles, not even the ocean could contain all that he did. He was always under the pressure of the crowds as they swarmed to him from distant parts of the region, from Galilee and Judea, Jerusalem and Idumea, even from beyond the Jordan, from around Tyre and Sidon, as we saw in Mark chapter 3. And as we've seen time and time again, this was a self-interested crowd. Their primary motive was to heal. They came to gain, not to heal. Furthermore, they were disrupted with Jesus' pattern of living, so that at times he could not even eat. It was difficult for him to simply sit down and enjoy a meal without being interrupted by someone begging to be healed, or by some demoniac rushing towards him, falling down before him, crying out to him. The crowds just didn't disturb his dinner table. They also disturbed his sleeping cycles. How exhausted must he have been in order to be fast asleep in the midst of a turbulent storm? And lastly, they pressed in on him and even threatened to physically crush him. If you've ever walked through a bustling crowd, perhaps Reading front of the market would be a good example. If you've ever visited that market during its peak lunch hours, then you'll know that simply walking through a crowd, bumping shoulders with people, having people scream right next to you all over the place is draining. You spent 30 minutes there. Well, that was the norm for 3 years. Yes, Jesus had his limitations. He was fully human after all. He was physically, emotionally, mentally stretched beyond what many of us can imagine. And yet, not once do we see Jesus turning to the crowds and saying, "Get away from me. I'm tired of having to deal with all of your sin." Not once do we see Jesus losing his patience and saying, "You guys are so stupid. Why can't you understand anything that I'm teaching? What a waste of my time. What's the point of it all?" He doesn't say that. And he doesn't say that because this is the reason why he came. Indeed, this humble posture is displayed once more in verse 22. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. Out of the crowds, out of the vast multitude of people, perhaps thousands of people, this one man by the name of Jairus comes to plead on behalf of his dying daughter. He's described as one of the rulers of the synagogue. I believe I've gone over this title before, but just in case, a ruler of the synagogue would have been a type of overseer of synagogue worship. He wasn't a scribe or a rabbi, so he wasn't the one actually preaching and teaching himself. However, he would have been responsible for things such as the maintenance of the building, or procuring scrolls used for scripture readings, or the order of worship liturgy. Given these weighty tasks, the ruler of the synagogue wasn't some random Joe. He would have been a well-respected member of the community, appointed by the office of elders, an integral part of the religious establishment. So to put that more concisely, Here is a man of high social standing. And so given who he is, it is surprising for us to see him fall at Jesus' feet. Certainly an act that would have been considered inappropriate for a man of his position. And he implores Jesus earnestly, Mark writes, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death." Literally, that might read like this: "My daughter is having her last moment." And in fact, we find out later on in verse 35 that by the time that Jesus arrives at Jairus' house, his daughter's already dead. So in Matthew's version of the same story, he compresses the events and has the ruler say to Jesus, "My daughter has just died." The point is, the girl's as good as dead. So surely what Jairus says next is meant to be understood as an expression of his faith, however meager that might be. He says, "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." Jesus, I know that it's hopeless, but if you come, there's hope. And what do we read? Verse 24. And he went with him. Don't glance over the significance of such statements. Do you think Jairus' daughter was the only girl that was dying? And how many in the midst of that crowd must have had similar issues, or even more pressing problems? And yet as Jesus is being torn asunder one way and the other by the innumerable demands, Mark tells us, and he went with him. Jesus drops everything that he's in the midst of doing in order to focus his attention upon this individual man. This is the way that one theologian describes this verse. It says, despite the fawning crowd, Jesus shows himself to be interruptible. And he enters the desperation of this lonely parent. So Jesus went with him. Mark testifies to Jesus' commitment to minister to human need and to the inestimable worth of the human individual for Jesus. Jesus shows himself to be interruptible. Have you ever thought about this? In his divinity, Jesus was omnipotent, meaning he could do anything, anytime, anywhere. He could have made a fire, rain down from heaven. He could have flown around in the sky. Better yet, he could have teleported wherever he went. He could have had laser beams coming out of his eyes. And now he's listening to superpowers. In other words, he could have demonstrated his power in ways that are more obvious and in some sense in ways that are more incredible than in the ways that he chose. But he chose to use his power not simply to flaunt his might, but to deliver people from their sufferings. Hence, at the beginning, the underlining theme here pertains to the pity behind God's power. Well, just as the plot thickens, just as the urgency of the situation begins to escalate, this story is interrupted. And technically speaking, this isn't a separate story that's inserted into the middle of another one. This is part of the same narrative. This was the actual flow of events. So to put it more accurately, the story isn't interrupted so much as Jesus is interrupted. Verse 24. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. In verse 24, for the second time, Mark reminds us of the presence of the crowd. And you might be thinking, yes, Mark, you just told us verses ago that there was a great crowd. But this isn't a superfluous detail. Because as we'll see in just a moment, the crowd is the context in which this woman will reach out and touch Jesus. That's important. They followed Jesus, they thronged about him, and you can imagine why. They want to see Jesus raise someone from the dead. The show's about to begin, and they want front row seats. So they're all followed. But then we're introduced to a woman. And this brings us to point number 1, the disease. We cannot know for certain the exact nature of this woman's condition. All we are told is that she had a discharge of blood. So it seems like she had some sort of an internal bleeding complication, perhaps an hemorrhage, a condition in which the rupture of a blood vessel causes an uncontrollable flow of blood. Furthermore, we are told that she had this condition for 12 years. Take a look at verse 42. Later, Mark tells us that the little girl that Jesus raises was also 12 years old. So this woman has been suffering for as long as Jairus' daughter has been alive. Not a short time. So after being introduced to Jairus, we are introduced to this woman. And you really couldn't have come up with two people who are on more opposite extremes of the spectrum when it comes to social standing. One is a man, the other is a woman. One's respected, the other is reveled. One's rich, the other's poor. One is a religious leader, the other is unclean. But you see, for Jesus, this man is little. When it comes to scattering the seed, as we saw in the parable of the sower, Jesus does so indiscriminately. He reaches out to all kinds of people. When you take a look at the Greek, in verses 25 and 26, you see that Mark uses a series of 7 participles, one after the other, to describe this woman's experience. In other words, by the use of an unusual grammatical construction, Mark is inviting you to step into this woman's world. Place yourself in her shoes for a moment. If you are constantly losing blood, imagine the pain. Worse than the pain, though, imagine the discomfort. Not just the discomfort, but imagine the fatigue. I think the women here will be better able to understand and sympathize in this manner. Now, aside from the physical symptoms, this woman's condition would be considered shameful. Whenever she went out, she probably dressed in all black so as to conceal the blood. And black would have been appropriate also because she was as a woman constantly in mourning. Verse 26 says she had suffered under many physicians, but she was no better. That's not a surprise because medicine only really became effective within the last 2 centuries or so. When you read parts of the Talmud, which is a collection of rabbinical teachings, the suggested remedies for a woman with a hemorrhage included things like this: drinking wine that had been boiled with onions, cumin, and safflower, and then having a rabbi exclaim over you, "Cease your discharge." Some of the more superstitious remedies included something as ridiculous as carrying around an ostrich egg in a bag. For whatever reason, during the summer it had to be linen, during the winter it had to be cotton. Another suggestion was to sift through manure in order to find barley corn that had been excreted from the rear of a donkey, and then carrying that barley corn around with you. These treatments weren't just ineffective, they were humiliating. We're also told that she had spent all that she had. She's not just physically constrained, but now she's lost all of her money. She has no more possessions. In those 12 long years, she must have tried every treatment that was out there, whether medical, religious, or even superstitious. Who knows how many countless potions she drank, how many physicians or rabbis or magicians had exclaimed blessings and incantations and spells and so forth. But while they kept on getting rich, she kept on being poor. Some undoubtedly tried to scam her, and she probably knew that, but she had to try anyways. There's more to this. Because in Leviticus chapter 15, according to the Mosaic law, a woman who had a discharge of blood was considered ceremonially unclean. Leviticus chapter 15, let me read a chunk of that passage for you. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge is in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything on which she lies shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches her bed, not her, whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean. And if any man lies with her and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, see people like this woman in our story, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. She's been unclean for 12 years. You see, a discharge of blood was symbolic of the way in which sin soils and corrupts all of us. There were many other things, by the way, that had such symbolic significance, so that Israel as a nation was just constantly being reminded that they are sinners. You may object by saying, how's that fair? It's not as though a woman can prevent herself from having her period. It's part of her menstrual cycle. How's that fair? Well, women weren't the only ones subjected to such unfairness. A leper couldn't help being a leper. A Gentile couldn't help being a Gentile. When it came to circumcision, a male couldn't help being a male. But you see, that's the point. Precisely because it is natural, it serves as an effective reminder. Because the truth is, we are all by nature born as sinners. It's not something you can avoid. This woman would have had zero physical contact with anyone for 12 years. In fact, given how much she spent, and how many positions she tried, how many years had passed, everyone in town must have known who she was as that woman with the discharge of blood. It's not just that she couldn't touch them, they probably bullied her like a plague. And the Pharisees, just as they did for fasting and Sabbath regulations, Pharisees took the laws regarding women's menstrual cycles and made it even more strict than what I read for you in Leviticus 15. For the sake of time, I won't go into that. But needless to say, it was absolutely debilitating and degrading. This woman has lost her health, she has lost her money, and she has lost her dignity. One day, she hears of a miracle worker, a healer, a man by the name of Jesus, Yeshua, Savior. And she wonders to herself, could he be my Savior? We looked at her disease, and now we look at the extent of her desperation, verse 27. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. She must have gone out having concealed herself, because in order to reach Jesus, she is forced to pry her way through this thronging crowd that Mark has been emphasizing in our passage. And as she does, every single person she touches, she makes unclean. If she's discovered, there's most definitely going to be an outrage, so she's really risking her safety at this point. But she doesn't care. She doesn't care because in her mind she's gotten to the point where she's saying, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. We don't know with what tone she said that. She could have said it as a confident declaration or a hopeful wish. But either way, I think what Mark is showing us here, and not just here, but in the story of Jairus, as well as the story of the paralytic and the leper, is that desperation often proves to be fertile grounds for dependence. But if everything that you can possibly depend on has been removed from your life, as it has been for this woman, where else can you turn? Except to God. Desperation precedes faith. Now don't misunderstand this woman's thoughts when she said, if I touch even his garments. It's not as though she's trying to be considerate of Jesus, avoiding direct contact with him in order to preserve his ritual purity. Because as I read for you in Leviticus, even if you touch the bed upon which an unclean lay, in other words, even if the contact is indirect, it still renders that person unclean. Not to mention, she's already touched hundreds of people as she's moving away from this crowd. So she knows the implications of her actions. As she reaches out and deliberately touches Jesus' cloak, she knows that she is transferring her uncleanness to him. And immediately, verse 29, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. 12 years of medication, 12 years of experimentation, all in vain, but in this split second, in the presence of Jesus, healed. Now you may have found it odd that this woman thinks to herself that merely touching Jesus' garment was going to heal her, because that kind of a notion sounds almost primitive. But then to have her thoughts confirmed in the course of events, and then to be told in verse 30 that Jesus perceived that power had gone out from him, we're left scratching our heads and wondering what's going on. What is this? Some sort of magical cloak? I don't think that's what's going on. In fact, it definitely is not, and we'll see why in just a bit. But in terms of what this woman thought, it is possible, I suppose. Perhaps she did indeed have a confused understanding of the way in which Jesus' power worked. But if she did, Jesus doesn't seem to correct her. This is what Charles Spurgeon writes about this very issue. He says, "Here is the great marvel of it. Little was her knowledge. Great was her unbelief. And as astounding as was her misconception of her Lord, yet her faith, because it was real faith, saved her." That phrase, perceiving that power had gone out from him, is a little bit mysterious, I admit. And I say that because that phrase isn't really used elsewhere in other healing miracles. It's somewhat unique. But without being over presumptuous, what Mark seems to be suggesting is that Jesus' power is something integral to who he is. It's personal power. He's not like the Green Lantern, who gets his power from a ring, and the ring itself gets its power in turn from some sort of planetary core or something like that. Jesus' power is not distinct from him. It is part of him. Omnipotence is one of his essential attributes. And so the disturbance that Jesus feels tells us that he is personally involved. Not just in this particular instance, but in every instance of healing. At the end of Mark chapter 6, as a summary statement, Mark writes that as many as touched the fringe of his garment, all were made well. That's what Mark says. But you see, I think our passage here helps us understand that later summary statement. Because it's not as though Jesus simply walked through the crowd And without even knowing it, he was healing people left and right, whoever he came in contact with, without any effort, without any involvement. That's not the picture that Mark wants us to have. He's not a detached healer, but in every case he is intimately involved. You see, he felt in himself his power going out from him when this woman touched him. He felt in himself the power go out when he touched the leper. He felt in himself the power go out when he touched you and when he touched me. And he healed me and you of our sins. He was intimately involved with the extraction of sin in your life. It was personal. Now, perceiving that he has been touched, immediately he turned about to the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" It's kind of strange, isn't it? In the midst of this great crowd, as I'm sure he was being pushed and pulled by everyone around him, he's able to tell that someone has touched him in a particular way, but he's not able to tell who it is. It's a little bit strange. Or at least that's what his question seems to imply. However, I don't think it's that he really doesn't know. I think he asks the question to draw this woman out. He wants her to voluntarily come to him. You see, she's been healed physically. There's more work to be done. And so from the disease to the desperation, we finally move on to our third point, the deliverance. Jesus' disciples respond to his question like I think any of us would have responded. Verse 31. And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" You can almost sense the tone here, can't you? What kind of question is that, Jesus? Everyone's touching you. They almost sound annoyed. Which reminds us, Jesus is actually on an urgent mission. Not too long ago, Jairus came to him pleading that he heal his daughter, telling him that she was on the brink of death. But as they're rushing towards his house, all of a sudden he stops and asks, "Who touched me?" Come on, Jesus, not wasting time. Let's go. The girl is dying. But you see, for the second time, in the midst of a pressing situation, Jesus has allowed himself to be interrupted in order to devote his attention to an individual need. And so once more, in his accessibility, in his availability, we get a glimpse into the compassionate heart of Jesus Christ, and that leads us to pause, I think, and ask ourselves the question, how available am I? Am I too busy to be interrupted by others? I'm not suggesting that you drop everything that you're doing every single time you need to meet every single humanitarian need in this world. But when there is an opportunity to share your time, your energy, whether that be in the office or in the classroom, in the church, to demonstrate the love of Christ, to testify to the gospel in your actions, do you take that opportunity? Do you make yourself available? Or do you have more important things to do? How many of us are guilty of acting as though we are busier than Jesus himself? This is hard. I know for one that I am. This woman is not yet fully restored. So don't underestimate the weight of what Mark is showing us. Her restoration, this is critical, her restoration now hinges upon the seemingly insignificant decision of this man Jesus to either continue walking and not be bothered by this low-class citizen, or to stop and spend the next 30 minutes in conversation with him. Comes down to that decision. And I hope you realize that is an ordinary, everyday situation that all of us face regularly. Well, Jesus decides to stop. In fact, we see that he searches out this woman with the same type of desperation that she searched for him. Meanwhile, he completely dismisses his own disciples. As Mark writes in verse 32, and he looked around to see what done. He doesn't even address his disciples' comments. At this point, you can only imagine what's going through the woman's head. What's Jesus going to say? She knows she's made him unclean. But has she? Because she also knows that she's been miraculously healed. Verse 33, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. You can tell that as soon as she had touched Jesus' cloak, she had started to make her retreat. Because Mark writes, she came in fear and trembling. The word there is althon, which also has the sense of returning. She returned. But when she hears Jesus calling out for the one who touched him, when she hears him calling out for her, she turns right around and in fear falls before him. One theologian reflecting upon this reaction writes that this woman's obsequious or subservient behavior reflects her humiliation from her long illness. In other words, he's suggesting that she is accustomed to being the object of shaming and reproach. And so it's almost as though it's been habitually ingrained in her to recoil in fear and submit to those in power. 12 years could do that to her. Then what happens next is quite amazing. After falling down before Jesus, Mark writes that she told him the whole truth. Well, what truth? She told him everything that she had just done. Not just that she touched him, but why she touched him. And it seems more than plausible the reason why Mark knows of her 12-year story is because her testimony went out. Her testimony went out in the midst of that very crowd on that very day. And this pattern is one that we ought to observe. Deliverance must always lead to doxology. If Christ has indeed saved you, bearing witness to that salvation is the only appropriate response. Or whatever fear that she had is dispelled by Jesus' gentle words. Verse 34. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. What is it that made her well? Was it magic? Was it some sort of intrinsic power in the garment itself? No. It was faith. Perhaps knowing her confused theology, Jesus draws her out for the very purpose of clarifying this for her. Salvation is by faith. Go in peace, he says. How appropriate, isn't it? Jesus gives her almost a type of benediction and tells her to go with the very thing that she's been looking for the last 12 years. Peace. What better words of encouragement? What words more satisfying to her soul? And lastly, he says, be healed of your disease. That is said in the present active tense. The woman obviously knew that she was healed. Mark already said that. But as his final word, Jesus gives her assurance. This isn't a momentary healing. She's not going to relapse. But now and continually she will live as one who is healed, as one who is clean. You see, I wonder if the reason why Jesus drew her out of the crowds and made this into a public scene was because he intended to restore her, not just physically, but also socially and religiously. Because although she knew she had been healed, now everyone, knows that she was. On one level, you could read this entire story, and you could understand it as nothing more than Jesus having healed a woman. But I think especially in this final verse, it is hard not to bring into view the spiritual and the eternal dimensions. When Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well," He's not saying that faith will heal you of every physical ailment. The word that He actually uses is sozo. Your faith has saved you. It's the same word that we use for salvation. And so just as a discharge of blood was a physical condition that symbolized the defilement of sin, so too this physical healing serves to symbolize the salvation from sin. When He says your faith has saved you, He's talking about both physical and spiritual. And don't miss how this happened. The woman was saved when she transferred her uncleanness to Christ, and Christ's holiness was transferred to her. That, my friends, is the gospel. And perhaps as Mark writes the ending, he has the cross in mind. Because when he writes, Jesus said, "Be healed of your disease." What it literally says is, "Be healed of your scourge." A word that can mean scourge or whip. The word that's used to describe the whip that scourges Christ before the cross. She is saved because Christ has taken upon Himself our sins. In closing, allow me to go back to the beginning of verse 34 and make just one more brief comment. Mark writes, and he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." This is a strange way to address a woman. In fact, in the entire New Testament, as surprising as this may be, only here does Jesus refer to a woman as daughter. This is the only instance. And knowing that, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why does He call her that? Well, you see, Jesus may have been interrupted by this woman, but at no point had He forgotten about another person in need. And as He addresses this woman, what's important to keep in mind for us as a reader is that off to the side, someone else with his own daughter to worry about is listening to Jesus' words. And as impatient and as anxious and as annoyed as he's getting with Jesus, what Jairus needs to know is the very words that Jesus speaks. "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Because it was also by faith that his daughter will be raised from the dead. Well, we'll have to pick up the story of Jairus next week. But as much as this lowly woman has unexpectedly become the model of faith for this lofty man Jairus, I wonder if she hasn't become the same for you. And so I invite you to come before Jesus in the same way that Jesus invited the woman to come before Him. Your knowledge of God may not be perfect. Your understanding of salvation may not be comprehensive. But if you find yourself in desperate need, perhaps you don't even know what it is that you need. If you find yourself searching for a cure, why don't you reach out and touch Jesus Christ?